Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, and I'm going to be your host this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, this has been a rough couple of weeks in terms of things hitting the news. Some bad stuff has come down through the headlines, both in terms of Supreme Court decisions and in terms of just general purpose atrocities committed by citizens upon other citizens. And I have to say, it feels good to hear a friendly voice. So thank you for joining me in this.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's been a miserable couple of weeks in the news, and it just seems so much gloomier overall than it did even a few years ago. Just unrelenting bad news.
It's been a bad run. But, you know, they say that laughter is the best medicine. And so here we are with a medicinal episode.
Can I mention one thing before we get into the substance?
Sure.
And this is good news. Today, Mark, we are taping our 50th episode of this podcast.
Wow. It's a landmark.
We started 2 years ago this month. I'm really proud of that. I hope you are too.
I am. 50 seems like a big number when I think about it, but then we also have been doing this for a while, so go us.
Yeah.
So let's talk about laughter. And this is the sort of topic that I like to think about because it's a feature of our everyday life that we tend not to really think about. So what's going on with that? And the question for this week is, why do we laugh? Why has the human species evolved into creatures that laugh? Because it's a pretty big physiological response. Sometimes if you're laughing really hard, you can actually struggle to breathe, which you would think would be an evolutionary disadvantage, because if you're being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger and you're cracking up at the same moment, then that makes it harder to run away. And yet here we are as creatures that laugh and will seek out opportunities to laugh. So I sent you down this rabbit hole, and I hope you came up with a, if not funny, at least interesting answer to the question, why do humans laugh?
Yeah, funny, I'm not so sure, but it's a great question, and it's a very Mark-like question, I must say. And, you know, I enjoy those kind of questions, so here we go. I want to start with a few pithy sayings about laughter. I'll tell you why in a second. It's the shortest distance between two people. Victor Borge said that. It's the foundation of reconciliation. St. Francis de Sales is responsible for that quote. It's the sun that drives winter from the human face. Victor Hugo said that.
Nice, Victor.
It's a force for democracy, said John Cleese.
Huh.
Based on the reading I've done over the last few weeks in preparation for this episode and some of the research I'm going to tell you about today, these are all provable claims. Humans laugh even before they speak, sometimes as early as 3 months after birth. This is true of deaf and blind babies as well, so laughter is not reliant on sight or hearing. Intelligence isn't a requirement for laughter either, meaning that even former President Trump should, in theory, be capable of laughter, even though he's shown no sign of it publicly.
He probably sees it as a sign of weakness.
Yeah, probably. Or maybe if the insurrectionists had hung Mike Pence, that might have gotten a guffaw out of him. Anyway, according to the Mayo Clinic, laughter has numerous physical benefits. It releases endorphins, the feel-good chemicals that relieve pain and stress and help us to be happy. It also increases your intake of oxygen, which stimulates your heart, lungs, and other muscles. The alternating increase and decrease of blood pressure and heart rate that comes from intermittent laughter increases blood circulation, which relieves tension in our bodies and can be profoundly relaxing. The positive, buoyant thoughts triggered by laughter can boost your immune system through the release of illness-reducing neuropeptides, or relieve pain by triggering production of the body's natural painkillers. For more than 2,000 years, thinkers have pondered the question, what is the essence of humor? Greek philosophers in the time of Plato offered what might be the first theory of humor, that people laugh at the misfortunes of others out of a feeling of superiority. Slapstick antics like slipping on a banana peel fit that ancient Greek formula.
Mm-hmm.
In the 18th century, a competing theory gained popularity that laughter allows us to blow off steam by releasing quote-unquote nervous energy.
Yeah.
Sigmund Freud thought this was why people found taboo topics amusing, like sexual or scatological themes, or topical humor about sensitive political or social issues. Such jokes allowed people to release energy as laughter that might have been suppressed in other more inappropriate emotions like hostility or desire.
That's a very Freudian take on humor, is it not?
Yes.
Like it's got to be about sex and desire, and you're either laughing or you're repressing it.
Yes, I must admit I didn't expect to come across Sigmund Freud's name in studying laughter, but there you go. Another theory of humor, widely accepted by contemporary researchers, posits that people laugh at incongruities, as when something happens in defiance of expectations or when there's a juxtaposition of seemingly incompatible concepts. Your perception of the incongruity, the shattering of your supposed reality, that's what's funny. Scholars have since refined this theory to propose that humor comes from people recognizing norm violations that aren't especially offensive or upsetting. The Italian psychologist Giovan Antonio Forabosco adds that, quote, the incongruity needs to be relieved without being totally resolved. It must remain ambiguous, something strange that is never explained, end quote.
Yeah.
Forabosco adds that other elements like sexuality, aggression, or even sadism can add to the impact of a joke, such that the best humor is sometimes equal parts intelligent and wicked. If you find the incongruity, the violation of the norm, to be benign, then chances are you'll find it funny, whereas if you find it scandalous or disgusting, you won't be amused.
Yeah. That makes me think of improv comedy. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, Joe, but I was in an improv group for 4 years.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's a long story. Maybe we can tell it in a future episode. But one thing that you figure out in improv pretty quickly is that the person who's being crazy on stage doesn't usually get the laugh. It's the person off to the side who is remarking on the craziness who tends to get the laughs.
Yeah.
And that's because the audience recognizes in that character their own perspective on looking at that outrageous behavior and saying, wow, that's crazy.
Right.
So it's kind of funny that the person who's being less ostensibly funny is usually the one who gets the laugh lines.
Yes. Yeah. And on this subject of incongruity, I can think of a perfect example of this concept. And I think you probably know this reference too. It comes from one of my favorite Monty Python sketches, the Mr. Creosote sketch in their 1983 film, Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. A hugely obese guy walks into a fine French restaurant, orders everything on the menu, vomits all over the staff, then explodes after eating a wafer thin mint for dessert.
It's very refreshing.
Yeah. Talk about exposing incongruities. It's a hugely transgressive sketch about gluttony and its intersection with decorousness. And I distinctly recall a lot of people walking out of the movie theater after seeing it. I'm going to link to a video clip of the sketch on our Facebook page. If you can manage that level of incongruity, it's worth a look.
Yeah. It is, but also the one Monty Python scene that my sister references frequently.
That one.
Yeah, she has said to me the phrase, it's wafer thin, dozens and dozens of times.
Yes. In reading for this episode, I learned that John Cleese, who was the waiter who speaks those lines in the film, had such a hard time composing himself, keeping himself from laughing. He tried to leave the camera range as soon as he said the word because he knew he was going to burst into laughter.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you laugh at something is also a function of your distance from the situation, either physically, it didn't happen to you, or temporally, it happened to you a long time ago. There's an old saying that humor is tragedy plus time.
Yeah.
Imaginary situations can also create distance. In one study, psychologists found that volunteers would laugh at a gruesome photo, like one of a man with a finger stuck up his nose and protruding from his eye, if told that the image was created with Photoshop, whereas they wouldn't laugh if told it was real.
Right.
The psychologist Peter McGraw at the University of Colorado at Boulder argues that the sweet spot for comedy is where there's a perfect balance between how bad something is and how distant it is. My take on these theories of humor is that it's all of the above, but these theories are more about what makes us laugh. They don't do an adequate job of explaining why we laugh, which is your question, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Scientists who study the latter subject think there are a few basic reasons why people laugh. First, it's in our genes. I've never seen Donald Trump in jeans, so maybe that's the reason he doesn't laugh.
He's certainly not in our genes. I would find that to be quite a violation if Donald Trump is wearing my jeans.
Right. Of course, I meant those other genes.
Yes.
We've known for a long time that apes laugh. Scientists first noticed in the mid-19th century that chimpanzees and other primates made a low panting sound when tickled or engaged in rough play. It sounds nothing like human laughter. It's low and guttural, more like a saw than a chuckle. But scholars now believe it's the progenitor of human laughter, which evolved from the common ancestor we shared with chimps and other great apes about 10 to 16 million years ago. In the 20th century, scientists performed tickle tests on infant and juvenile gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees, and reported that they responded with quote-unquote tickle-induced vocalizations. Coco, the famous gorilla who learned sign language, made distinct laughing noises when her handler did something clumsy or when visited by people she especially liked. Chimps also employ laugh faces when they smile with their teeth bared, with or without vocalizing. Neuroscientists perform similar tickle tests on rats and noticed that they made the same chirping noises they did during play, sometimes following the hand that tickled them. So there must be an evolutionary benefit to laughter, which occurs in all human societies and in some other mammals. But what is it? In a 2005 paper, the evolutionary biologists David Sloan Wilson and Matthew Gervais offered an explanation founded in group selection, the evolutionary theory that in social species like humans, natural selection favors characteristics that increase the survival of not just individuals, but the group as a whole. Wilson and Gervais studied two types of human laughter: the spontaneous, involuntary kind that serves as a genuine expression of joy and amusement during play or joking around, and the studied, less emotional imitation of laughter employed for socially strategic reasons, like the polite smiles or laughter that punctuates ordinary conversations, regardless of whether they're funny. The genuine laughter is called Duchenne laughter, named after the 19th century scholar who first described it, while the other is called non-Duchenne laughter. Wilson and Gervais proved that Duchenne laughter arises in the brain stem and limbic system responsible for emotions. It evolved from the games of early primates, and it's related to animal vocalizations. Whereas the non-Duchenne laughter comes from the part of the frontal cortex responsible for planning movements and evolved much later with the development of language and casual conversation. Wilson and Gervais claim that Duchenne laughter was a force for social cohesion in our long-extinct human ancestors between 2 and 4 million years ago. It promoted happy interactions in group members during times of safety and satiation. That laughter, in response to cues that Wilson and Gervais called proto-humor, became the basis for the more complex forms of humor that arose much later when humans developed more sophisticated social and cognitive skills. That's also when non-Duchenne laughter first appeared, calculated and sometimes even aggressive and derisory. The sense of connection conjured by laughter serves the evolutionary purpose of helping us to quickly determine somebody's allegiances and whether they're cooperating with us, a skill that's essential for safety and survival. This skill is surprisingly well developed in people. In one large study of nearly 1,000 participants spanning 24 different societies, researchers played short sound bites of pairs of people laughing together. In some cases, the pair were close friends. In others, they were strangers, so the laughter was of both the Duchenne and the non-Duchenne variety. Using as their only clue the sound of the laughter, participants were asked to gauge the friendship level of the laughers. The listeners could reliably determine the difference between those who were longtime friends and those who had just met. The results suggest not only a link between real laughter and friendship, but also that those who pretend laugh at jokes aren't fooling anybody.
Yeah.
Another evolutionary explanation of humor came from the cognitive scientist Matthew Hurley, psychologist Reginald Adams, and philosopher Daniel Dennett in their 2011 book, Inside Jokes, Using Humor to Reverse Engineer the Mind. The book started with Hurley's intuition that, quote, humor is related to some kind of mistake. Every pun, joke, and comic incident seemed to contain a fool of some sort, the butt of the joke, end quote. But it's not the mistake we enjoy. It's what Hurley calls the, quote, emotional reward for discovering and thus undoing mistakes in thought, end quote. In other words, weeding them out, weeding out the mistakes. That's what gives us satisfaction. The book explores Hurley's thesis that our minds continuously theorize about what will happen next and about the intentions of others, and that humor evolved from this process. People are amused when they find harmless discrepancies between expectations and reality, and the pleasure in such discovery keeps us looking out for such discrepancies. The authors cite this example. I was wondering why the Frisbee was getting bigger, and then it hit me. Right?
It's a good one.
Yeah. So humor is a supernormal stimulus that triggers a burst of pleasure, and our sense of humor is primed to react favorably to such discrepancies the way our taste buds react to a rich dessert. Laughter is the public demonstration of our ability to recognize discrepancies. Sounds a lot to me like the incongruity theory, doesn't it?
It is funny that just violating expectations, just you're expecting A and you get B, that the response to that is laughter.
Yes.
I hadn't really thought about that, but it lines up.
Yeah. And it's important that the discrepancy not be threatening in any profound way. It's an innocent discrepancy. That's what triggers the laughter. Because some things, some incongruities, some discrepancies are not funny.
Right. That's the difference, I suppose, between a comedy and a horror movie. In Jaws, when the shark leaps out at you at the moment you are not expecting it, that is not funny.
Yes. No, that's a good point. The laughter creator, the funny person, enjoys an elevated social status. I mean, who wouldn't want to be Gallagher or Carrot Top? A good sense of humor might also contribute to reproductive success by signaling that you have good genes and a healthy brain, which attracts partners. Researchers have found that men are more likely to be funny than women because they compete for the attention of women, who do the choosing because they're more likely to appreciate humor.
can we pause for our female listeners and ask the question, is it possible that the researchers who say that men are more funny than women are in fact men? And that women are maybe just as funny as men, but they don't get the same recognition? Because I have heard that.
Yes.
From female comedians.
Yes.
That they have trouble getting recognized as funny people.
Yes, fair point. And I think the flip side of the other piece of this also applies. In other words, men are not good at deciding what's funny or not because they're used to competing, being on display and not being the judges of humor. So right. Actual female humor is sometimes indecipherable by men because they just aren't wired to know what's funny and what's not.
Yes.
But all this work I'm citing suggests another important reason people laugh. Laughter is a social activity. There's a psychology professor named Robert Provine at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, who studies laughter the way ornithologists study birdsong. Provine taped people's laughing and brought the recordings to the National Zoo's Sound Analysis Lab to map out the laughter's frequency and pitch. Provine also did field research in food courts, student centers, and shopping malls, documenting thousands of conversations that provoked instances of laughter. One of Provine's most interesting findings is that laughter doesn't come from what we call humor. Only 10 to 15% of the remarks that trigger laughter are even remotely funny. Some are downright dull. Anyone who suffered through a stand-up routine by Andrew Dice Clay understands this phenomenon. People laugh when they're with other people, regardless of the humor in the exchange. Laughter, then, is a tool for social bonding. Provine explains it this way, quote, "Laughter and humor are related but different things. Laughter is ancient. It's a primate play vocalization. Humor is a more modern cognitive and linguistic development. There was laughter long before there was humor." End quote.
Yeah, what that makes me think of is there's a researcher called John Gottman. Have you heard of him?
No.
He does work on basically marriage and relationships and the ones that stay together and the ones that fall apart. And he came up, after a bunch of observational work, he came up with a theory that basically all forms of communication within a relationship are about what he calls a bid for connection, where no matter what you say to your partner, your friend, your coworker, whether it's informational or it's a joke or you're asking for attention, basically that is a bid for a connection with that person, and then that person either in Gottman's terms, turns towards you in terms of responding positively, turns away from you in terms of just ignoring the thing, or turns against you in terms of like shouting at you. And so it occurs to me that within a Gottman framework, what you're talking about here is when someone says something and you laugh, that is, they were making a bid and you were turning toward the bids to cement the social relationship.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Provine also reported that we're 30 times more likely to laugh in the company of others than by ourselves. When adults are alone, they're likely to talk to themselves or smile rather than laugh. Similarly, young children are 3 to 4 times more likely to laugh at cartoons if they're with other children, even though they're just as likely to report that the cartoon was funny regardless of who was or wasn't with them. It's like being with other people gives us the permission to laugh. Provine's research showed that speakers were nearly 50% more likely to laugh than their listeners, punctuating their sentences with laughter at particular places in the vocal stream. He also found that congenitally deaf people laughed at the very same junctures in signed conversations that hearing people did in spoken conversations. It's hardwired in all of us. And as the old saying goes, laughter is contagious. Just listening to someone else laugh can be enough to make us laugh too. On that last point, I have a cherished memory I want to share. My mother loved Mark Twain's short stories and turned me on to them at an early age. In adulthood, I read a short story that reminded me of Mark Twain, and I wanted to share it with my mother. It was Moonface by Jack London, of all people. This is the guy who wrote The Call of the Wild. But it's a fiendishly funny story about a man who kills another man because he doesn't like the way he looks. It's PD now, so I'm going to link to it on our Facebook page if you want to read it. Anyway, I attempted to read this story to my mother, and I laughed so hard that I could barely breathe, and that made her laugh until she was in tears. It was just a magical experience for both of us.
That's nice. I did not have a father who would laugh from his belly. My father was too tightly controlled to do something like that. But I do remember after my parents got divorced, in the period when by court order I needed to spend a portion of each summer with him in the house of the woman that he remarried, who I did not have a good relationship with her. That was a period when I had a very fraught relationship with my father. Like, I was staying in the house that he was in, but we barely spoke.
As a captive, too.
Yeah. But one thing that we did together that I remember doing together is that I had fallen into the habit of watching Monty Python reruns on TV. And he came by one day and saw me watching and sat down, and we laughed through the episode together. And it felt like the one time that summer that we were on the same page is when we had this common thing that we could laugh at.
Yeah. A psychology professor at Vanderbilt University named Joanne Bakarowski built on Robert Provine's work by creating a database of laugh sounds, which you can also listen to on her website. And I'll link to that on our Facebook page as well. The sound clips distinguish between chuckles, cackles, grunts, and snorts, whether the laughs are voiced or unvoiced. I'll explain that in a second. And whether air is expelled through the mouth or the nose. Bakarowski's work centers on figuring out what these differences mean. One of her published studies found that both male and female listeners responded more positively to sing-songy, voiced laughter than to snorting, unvoiced laughter. The respondents said the sing-song voice sounded friendlier and more pleasing to the ear, and they were more likely to want to meet the person who produced it. According to Bakarowski, these reactions hint at laughter's evolutionary purpose. We use it to communicate to people that we mean them no harm. Here's a quote from Bakarowski. Humans rely on cooperative behavior with non-kin to an extent that isn't seen in other species. But humans are also inherently competitive. So the idea is that we had to evolve some means that let others know we feel positively towards them. End quote. She believes that voiced laughter, with its vowel-like sounds like ha ha ha, he he he, is that means.
Yeah, and it seems to me like the fact that it's so hard to fake laughter would contribute to that, because this is a form of human expression where it's just really hard to lie within a laugh.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to signal good intent, signaling it by way of laughter is just much more credible than any other spoken statement.
Right, and as those earlier studies proved, people can tell the difference between real laughter and fake laughter instantly. It's just wired inside us. But left unsaid in Bakarowski's work is why we also evolved unvoiced laughter, the grunts and snorts that are much less welcoming to our ears. But interestingly, one of Bakarowski's follow-up studies found that autistic children who tend to produce very honest auditory signals of their internal states have a much higher ratio of voiced to unvoiced laughter than other children, which suggests that voiced laughter is our default laugh. Now, there's one other theory for why people laugh that I wanted to run by you. It claims that laughter was a replacement for primate grooming behavior. Physical grooming is a time-consuming act of generosity and friendship that stimulates the release of endorphins, but it's inefficient in that it works on just the one being groomed. Humans tend to have larger friend groups than other primates, and the thinking is that alternatives like laughing, as well as singing, dancing, and storytelling, developed so we could groom more than one person simultaneously. Laughing multiplies the endorphin rush by affecting both the joke teller and all within earshot of the funny remark.
So what you're suggesting, Joe, is if humans had taken a slightly different evolutionary path, we would be getting together with coworkers after work to take the lice out of each other's hair?
Perhaps, yes. But good thing we took that turn, right?
Yes, particularly since the primates I've seen who groom each other don't just pluck out the lice, they also eat it, which is distasteful, particularly within a work scenario.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be work appropriate. There would be HR rules against it.
And you may not remember this, Mark, but the last time I tried to pick insects off your back, you slapped me. Thank you very much, folks. So, which is it? Why do we laugh? I think the same thing about all these theories of why we laugh as I do about the theories of humor I cited earlier. They don't seem mutually exclusive to me. It's all of the above. We laugh for a lot of reasons, and they all make sense.
Yeah, my general rule of thumb with all of these theories and theorists is that the theory that boils a complex phenomenon down to a single cause is always oversimplifying things.
Yeah.
For some reason, we tend to prefer theories that are simple and unitary and like the one rule that guides them all. But life is messy. Humans are messy. And so it just makes more sense that we would have messy and conflicting and overlapping forces governing our behavior.
Right. Wasn't there that, thinking of the podcast we did about Richard Dawkins' theory where he said, basically, I alone know what's going on here, and my theory is the only one that makes sense. And we both were very skeptical for that exact reason you just said.
Right.
Okay, one last pithy remark about laughter before we go. A day without it is a day wasted. Charlie Chaplin said that. Unlike the other pithy remarks, that's not a provable claim. It's subjective. But it resonates with me, and I suspect with you too, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
As you correctly pointed out in your question, we laughed a lot together in college. I think our similar senses of humor have been a large part of our relationship, and that shouldn't surprise us. As Giovanni Sabato wrote in Scientific American, quote, shared laughter signals a commonality of worldviews, preferences, and convictions, which reinforces social ties and the sense of belonging to the same group, end quote. For you and me, laughter has been a super glue cementing our friendship for the past 4 decades. I think that's why we still laugh together, and I wonder whether you agree.
I do agree. When I think of funny people I've known, Joe, my first thought is always of you. And it was the thing that connected us in college. I think it's kept us connected in the years since, and it's connecting us here today. So laughter's the glue.
Yeah, for sure. So how do you think I did in answering this question? I put a lot of stuff on the table there.
I think this episode provided a tremendous amount of food for thought. And I think this is the sort of question that is never going to have a definitive answer. And so I kind of set you up for a messy conclusion, and you provided an appropriately messy answer to my question. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it is really fascinating to me, though, in the course of the research for this, how many scholars are researching laughter. There's just gazillions of them in all different disciplines.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine that if you're a scholar and you're thinking, what am I going to work on next? And someone suggests, why don't you work on laughter? That would seem like a pretty good idea to me. Like, I would love to work on laughter.
Yeah.
That seems like it would be the sort of thing that would be fun to study, fun to think about. You get up in the morning and it's like today's job is to think about laughter. Like, who would not want a job like that?
Right. And I mean, including serious philosophers, both ancient and contemporary, like Daniel Dennett is like a very high profile philosopher.
Yeah.
And he's working on this subject.
Though I have to say, anecdote from my past, my parents collected many, many books. And in my childhood, I would go through the bookshelves and pull down things that looked interesting. And one of them was a volume called The Humor of Christ. And I can't say I read it cover to cover, but I got into it and I at least skimmed it. And I have to say, this book, which was bent on establishing that Jesus was a jokester who was constantly making up witticisms and pointing to points in the Gospels to establish this was the least funny book I have ever encountered. And I was not at all convinced that Jesus was funny. But maybe it was all in the delivery. I don't know.
So Jesus was no Gallagher. That's what you're telling me, right?
No, he might have been a Carrot Top, though.
Yeah. Okay. Time for your question for next time.
Yeah, bring it on.
So this is going to be a very Joe-like question in contrast to the Mark-like question you put to me. And I apologize for that in advance. Someday I will come up with a Mark-like question for you, Mark. But for now, here's your question. My question for next time combines two hot-button issues in the news right now, abortion and crime. A controversial 2001 academic paper co-authored by economists John Donahue of Yale and Stephen Levitt of the University of Chicago suggested that there's a connection between the legalization of abortion after the Supreme Court's 1973 decision in Roe v. Wade and the reduction in crime that followed about a generation later. They argued that the newly widespread availability of abortion resulted in fewer children born to parents who either didn't want them or couldn't support them, thus keeping off the streets many people at elevated risk of committing crime. In a country awash in guns and whose crime rate is again on the rise, and where Roe v. Wade is no longer the law of the land, Mark, I want you to tell me more about the Donahue-Levitt hypothesis and whether it holds water.
Okay, that's some heavy stuff.
My apologies.
Yeah, I will try to hold on to some of the levity of this episode as I delve into the darker waters of abortion and crime rate.
Maybe you can bring a Carrot-Topian perspective to the subject.
Or a Gallagher and just smash watermelons with a big hammer as I read through the sources.
That's okay, too, as long as there's a video component. This might be our first video episode.
Right. Okay, so that's it for our episode on laughter. If you have any thoughts on this episode or something funny to say about it, or if you think that we were not funny when we were trying to be, you can leave comments on this episode on our Facebook page or comment on previous episodes. You can also suggest future episodes that we should do. You can find it on Facebook at Mansplaining the Podcast. We do hope that you come by, give a like to our page, and leave a few comments.
Give us congratulations for putting 50 of these episodes together for you.
Right, right.
We do it all for you.
Yes, in service to you, we've done 50 episodes. So for God's sake, you can at least leave a comment.
What a bunch of ingrates.
I know.
Screw you all.
And now that we've finished insulting you, I would also like you to suggest to friends and family that they listen to this podcast, or maybe swing by Spotify or Apple Music or wherever it is that you get your podcasts and leave us a rating and a review. Anything that you can do to help us grow this audience, it's deeply appreciated and will somewhat lessen the contempt with which we hold you. But that's it for this week. My name's Mark. That was Joe. And thank you for spending some time with us.
We'll talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.